Okay. My name is Emma Banks. I see some familiar faces, so I'm glad to see some people returning. I'm the Secondary Digital Learning and Computer Science Specialist at the Department of Ed, and I am joined here by John, who I will let introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Graham. I'm the Elementary Digital Learning Specialist, and thankful that my co-host has power and internet back.
Yeah, it's quite unexpected, that moment where you're like, oh, I'm glad to be out of the office. And then you're like, well, the office has power. Maybe I'm not glad. So. Okay, so today we are embarking on the first part of week 2 of module 2, which, yes, it is a mouthful. Today we'll be talking about asynchronous learning and synchronous learning and kind of how they work together and some differences between the two. And diving in a little bit deeper into some models as well. So starting with just a general overview of synchronous and asynchronous learning, kind of how they look and feel. One thing that I will mention about this list is that just because one is in one list does not mean that it does not exist in the other format. It's just that these are kind of some of the traits that are most commonly occurring in a synchronous or an asynchronous environment. So in an asynchronous learning environment, the teacher and students are separated by time and or place. It doesn't necessarily have to be both, but oftentimes it is. Asynchronous learning is often instructor facilitated and student centered. There's delayed feedback and communication. There's the instantaneous part there would be incidental versus purposeful in that moment. You could have a synchronous back and forth in an asynchronous learning environment, but it would be delayed by who's submitting and whatnot. So it wouldn't be an instant chat, but it would get pretty close in the delayed feedback part. Asynchronous learning is a great place to increase student autonomy and agency. Students really have to be motivated and self-directed to be successful in an asynchronous learning environment. So kind of emphasizing those kinds of things can really help with creating success. An asynchronous environment also has the ability to have a global connection versus just the classroom connection. Not that a classroom connection couldn't have a global connection, but when you're in an asynchronous learning environment, students are already kind of connected to that global world. So anything you can do to bring that into the asynchronous learning environment is great. And something I'm sure that most of you are familiar with asynchronous learning is that it is coined as the anywhere, anytime learning. While obviously there are some limitations around that, the idea that students can kind of access learning at their own pace and reach mastery kind of on their own increments versus the classroom timed types of things. Synchronous learning, I think, is the area where people are probably more comfortable. Teacher and students are connected at the same time and place. This can also translate to a virtual environment. So you could have a video conference that would be a synchronous learning experience. It's usually classroom centered, so you have a class meeting together to discuss a certain thing or to accomplish an activity, solve a problem. The instructor is usually the leader. Of course, sometimes there are student-led things in synchronous learning, but it tends to be more instructor-led. And feedback is also more instantaneous. Of course, essays and things of that nature still require some time for grading, but the ability to kind of guide and nudge students in the right direction is much easier in a synchronous environment. Because of that, sometimes students are more reliant on the instructor in a synchronous environment. They really want that next step, that next move, whereas in asynchronous learning, that kind of has to be built into the experience since you're not right there. And then just the idea of having classroom-based learning experiences are often kind of centered in the classroom. Again, that can be a virtual classroom, but that would also be a synchronous experience for students. So looking at this a little bit more technically as for examples of what would be synchronous and what would be asynchronous. You've got video conferencing, like I mentioned, would be a synchronous version. To make that asynchronous, you could record a lecture for delayed viewing or quick videos. we've talked a lot about like making those quick self-recorded videos, so that would fall into that category. Instant messaging would be synchronous, whereas discussion boards would be asynchronous. Flipgrid would be asynchronous, even so it would feel more synchronistic, because there is that delay. So, you know, a student may not be right there responding, whereas in an instant message, there's that expectation that they're right there ready to respond. Again, pointing to the feedback, the discussion and feedback is delayed versus instantaneous. In a live classroom, there's it's kind of happens right on the spot. There are some pros and cons to both of those. You know, in an asynchronous environment kind of allows students to have a little bit more time to digest ideas before they're responding to them. So really kind of focusing on what you're trying to achieve can help you to determine if synchronous or asynchronous is a good fit for your learning activity. And so this just kind of re-emphasizes there's a little bit of repetitive information in these couple slides, but we wanted to kind of separate them and build out on them a little bit as well. So you can kind of see this idea that the autonomy and agency it's very student-centered. It has to kind of come from that intrinsic motivation piece, which is what most of these pieces kind of speak to. And then again, a little bit more information on synchronous learning. Having that cohort and network of support is something that is kind of organically existing in a synchronous environment. It could exist in an asynchronous environment, but it does take a little bit more facilitation. And so we've got a couple of examples of learning experiences. And we kind of want to just go through, and you don't have to like type in the chat. You could if you want to race to see who gets it first. But just kind of looking at these examples and determining which one's the synchronous one and which one's the asynchronous one, just to kind of help frame it around some actual activities. So a student connects to a live video conference call with their teacher and classmates, or a student navigates to a lecture that a teacher has uploaded to a platform. One of these is synchronous and one of these is asynchronous. And that was a delay. So the synchronous activity is the one that has the student connecting with their classmates in real time. They're connected via video and audio. So they're having a collaborative experience in the moment, whereas the student that's navigating to a lecture, that student is separated from their teacher by time and place. So that's an asynchronous learning experience. In our next example, we have a student joining a video conference and playing a teacher-led quiz game with other students. And we have a student accesses digital flashcards to practice content knowledge. And looking at which one's asynchronous and which one's synchronous, the student that's joining the live video conference and playing the game with students and classmates would be the synchronous, and then the student accessing digital flashcards to practice their content knowledge would be an example of asynchronous. Students work together in groups in a shared document to collaborate and solve a real-world problem. Or students work together in groups in a virtual breakout room to collaborate and solve a real-world problem. I really like this example because the outcome is exactly the same. It's just the method that is used to achieve that outcome. So you can see clearly that both of these methods would work very well with the right facilitation, but one's asynchronous and one is synchronous. So there's all sorts of ways that you can incorporate both types of learning into your classroom. My PowerPoint is really slow. One moment. Okay, the last one we've got is the teacher posts a discussion prompt and students respond via an online discussion board. Or the teacher reads a discussion prompt and students have an in-class discussion. So by now you're probably an asynchronous, synchronous pro, and you know exactly which ones are asynchronous and synchronous. And if the PowerPoint loads, it'll actually tell you. Okay. So hopefully that's helpful in kind of framing what asynchronous learning looks like in comparison to synchronous learning. Now that we've established that, I want to just pause for a moment and mention this idea that synchronous and asynchronous learning is not about which one is better. It's about using both of these tools in your learning experiences with your students. sometimes, like, you'll have an activity where a synchronous learning experience would be a much better fit. Does that mean that synchronous learning across the bar is better? Not necessarily. There's definitely a lot of research that supports both approaches are effective at achieving learning gains. So keeping in mind to keep both of those things into your toolbox is a really great way to kind of frame your thoughts about synchronous and asynchronous learning. It doesn't have to be all one, and it doesn't have to be all the other. And that, in fact, leads us to our next point, which is the idea of blended learning. And this is something that I'm sure is not new to a lot of you, but in case it is, this definition is provided by blendedlearning.org. They call themselves Blended Learning Universe. They have some really fantastic resources that we'll talk a little bit about in a few moments, but they define blended learning based on 3 criteria. One is that blended learning is any formal education program in which a student learns at least in part through online learning with some element of student control over time, place, path, or pace. And that's a mouthful. But that idea that there should be student flexibility involved and that at least some of their learning will happen via technology. The other piece is that students learn at least in part in a supervised way. Now, their definition includes brick and mortar away from home. And so I wanted to include that just to do their definition justice. However, I think that's somewhat limited because you can have a blended learning environment in a virtual environment. It's just a combination of synchronous and asynchronous components. So when you're thinking about your brick and mortar location, that could certainly be your virtual classroom, your synchronous time together when you are supervising, so to say. And then the other piece is the modalities along each student's learning path within a course or subject are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. This can be a little bit more challenging. I would say that this is more the higher reach of a blended learning model. Once you kind of reach that step, you're doing really fantastic. But this is just that idea that a blended learning path should not be separated. So the work that they're doing outside of the class should be directly related to the work that they're doing inside the class. They should build upon one another, and there should be a clear progression of that experience so that the student isn't in class learning about these things and then outside of class learning about this other thing that doesn't seem to be relating. So they're not making those connections. So trying to make sure that there's a clear path for your students through that blended learning world is a really great practice. I really appreciate this quote because it focuses on the innovation piece of blended learning. It really enhances the ability for students to learn when they can kind of do some of that more time-consuming processing outside of the class and then really come back to class and have those meaningful discussions where you're troubleshooting some of those other things versus just the reading of the passage in the classroom. If you have them read the passage outside the classroom, which that's just one example, then you can really make room for innovation is what I want to say. So again, from the people at Blended Learning Universe, going blended is about more than just technology. It's about rethinking instruction and effectively managing innovation over time. So this really puts the emphasis on providing innovative learning experiences for students and making room for them to innovate. And blended learning can be a really great method for doing that. So we're going to talk a little bit about designing for blended learning, just kind of briefly. I don't want to get too deep into it because you could do a whole thing on it, but we're just going to kind of give an overview and then we'll provide some resources at the end. So if you really want to dig into designing for blended learning, then you certainly could. So a few things to keep in mind when you're getting started. You always want to use the practices of backwards design, really whenever possible when designing instruction in a virtual format or in a blended format, so where there's going to be some virtual instruction. I'm sure that backwards design is not a new concept to many of you, but just in case it is, there are resources where you can kind of dig into that. But that's the idea of just starting with your outcomes and goals and moving backwards from there to enhance your design. So kind of asking yourself some questions. How will students connect with their learning? Consider asynchronous versus synchronous. Which activities should they or would they do better with if they do it on their own? Which ones need more time for reflection? which ones would be better if people have the chance to really do some more research on something when they're, they don't have the confines of class time. Which parts of the lesson are most effective in asynchronous and which ones are most effective in asynchronous? These are two really big questions because they will help you to determine how to actually structure your blended model, like which parts will be in your class and which parts will be kind of the synchronous. I mean the asynchronous, yeah, I said the opposite of what I was thinking. So blendedlearning.org has this really phenomenal resource that I'm going to walk through for just a few minutes to show you kind of how you can walk yourself through the design process of designing a blended learning experience or a blended learning lesson. And they have this really great graphic. I love how pretty it is. So give just one moment for this to load up. And I'll get it on the right screen. And so this is blendedlearning.org's homepage. And I'll just want to point out a couple things before I show you the really cool part. One is that they have educator insights, and basically that's a blog where you can hear from other teachers on how they're doing blended learning and strategies, tips, tricks, stuff like that. And then they have a really great page on the basics, including the definition that we talked about already, as well as some in-depth research on the effectiveness of blended learning. And then this piece right here is designing, because of course, what's one of the most challenging things about this part, and that's the design piece. So they have this interactive graphic, which is really cool. I need to learn how to make one of these. And so they have start with your rallying cry, kind of you want to know your problem that you're trying to solve. What's the goal? And then assembling your team. Assembling your team could be selecting your resources, depending on what you have. You might need to use some interpretation to kind of make this process fit your needs. If you don't have a team, then you may not be assembling an actual team. Motivating students, elevating teaching, choosing the right technology, designing your classroom. That includes your virtual classroom, designing your virtual space, how students are gonna interact. Choosing your model, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. John's gonna run us through some really effective blended learning models. Creating a culture and refining and iterating. This piece right here, step number 9, this is going to be like where all the gold happens, basically. When you are building a virtual learning experience, and you might not like hearing this, but it's almost never done. We always are constantly want to reevaluate and rethink it and kind of like look at it, make sure it's still effective, make sure the technology hasn't changed too much to where it's no longer effective. So that idea that like this is a wheel, this is a circle, so you're going to reach step 9, then eventually it may not be like right as you hit step 9, but eventually you'll kind of want to go through this process again and make sure that your blended learning experience is still, reaching those goals, solving those problems, and going all the way through to creating your culture. And so that probably is a little overwhelming, but this website has some really great resources to help you with this. And that is one thing that I'm just so happy about finding. So it has all 9 steps. I just clicked on step 1 when we were on that last page. It brings you through their steps for starting with your rallying cry. It has a quick tip. And then when you scroll down to the bottom, they have a template for how to actually go through this process. What's nice is that each step of this model has a template that you can kind of follow through. So ultimately, you could grab each page of this template and really walk through all 9 steps of their design process if you were interested in really digging into blended learning. I think that at the surface level, you should definitely be familiar with these 9 steps in at least a basic format, so that you're kind of designing in a circular format, so that you're constantly kind of reevaluating and revisiting how things are going. John and I talk a lot about building in feedback and things of that nature into your sessions with students. So anything that you can kind of do to help yourself evaluate how the experiences are going. You know, students are really great at giving that kind of feedback when they're given prompts that will lead them there. So at this point, I am going to hand things off to John, and he's going to talk a little bit about some models for blended learning.
All right, so there are a lot of different models out there, and we'll have some resources later on. So if you want to look at some of the other variants of them, but we tried to boil it down to 3 main models to focus on for today. So we're going to look through those models. I know we have an activity for you guys to do. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the flipped model. So if you've heard people talk about a flipped classroom or something like that, that's kind of the idea with that one. Students are exposed to new material outside of synchronous class time. So that's, I think, one of the big things is that students will be doing work outside of class. So it's maybe reading texts or watching videos. So those things that sometimes you might show the whole class or do with the whole class, they're doing those activities outside of class. And then when you come to class, class time is used to help students dig into that material. And then that allows the teacher to support the learning process in real time. So when the students come to class, they will have done some previous work. Sometimes we call it homework, but they've done that work previously to the class time. And then when you come to class, you can dig into the content a little bit more with the work that they've done. And you can maybe reinforce, kind of bolster some of those challenges that they might have had with the work. So I think the class time sometimes can be much more effective. So that's kind of the flipped model and how that works. Moving on to the next one, a rotation model. For my elementary teacher friends, I'm sure this is something that you've seen or maybe used yourself before, but students rotate through centers and stations. Usually they have a fixed time schedule. And then each station has different components, tasks, activities. This is a fantastic way to differentiate within your classroom and kind of figure out your students' preferences, and you can kind of plan future rotation options accordingly. Learning's active and fluid, so kids are able to move between those different sessions. And it can, certainly with younger classes, it can provide some challenges around training your students to know how to work within this model. But I have gone into a number of kindergarten classrooms and I've seen students work within this model so effectively. Students pairing up and working on pieces together, using QR codes to access content online, solving some sort of problem in a group, doing hands-on activities. So it really is a nice way to differentiate within a classroom and do all kinds of different fun activities. And then the final one is project-based learning. So this is something I'm sure many of us have a level of familiarity with. So students are going to work either individually or in groups to create some sort of project. Project obviously is a very broad term, and that project can look, like any number of different final products there. So the focus of the project may be personalized to aid motivation. So that can be a major factor for some students, is finding what is that project, what is that content, what is that piece that they're working on that will really pull them through the process. And then the teacher is going to have that class time to focus on research. This is a great time to go over digital literacy skills and be bolstering those. Group work, if you're assigning those groups or students are self-assigning their groups, can be a nice time to figure out those group mentalities that people sometimes have and work on those. And then also having those periodic check-ins with students, so you make sure they're making progress through this whole process. The work should largely be self-directed, but not entirely. You're going to have some check-ins there if they're working with a group, making sure that everybody's staying on task. And if they're working by themselves, making sure that they're staying on task and kind of understand their next steps as they go through the process. So those are the 3 kind of big models that we're going to look at for our activity.
Should we pause for a moment before we get into the activity and see if anyone has any questions?
Sure.
I know we've covered a lot, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and just chime in, or you can type them in the chat, whatever works best for you. And then we'll work on the activity that John mentioned, kind of looking at these models a little bit more closely.
So Julia put in the chat, I wonder if the rotation model would work well with pre-assigned breakout rooms. There we go, rotation model. So I think that's definitely an option. I know that some teachers are kind of thinking about different ways to use breakout rooms with students. The challenge that you might have, I know some districts have had the expectation if students are in a breakout room, they want a staff person in there. So it might be a matter of, pairing with another staff member or an ed tech, somebody like that, bringing them in so they can help supervise that group if that's an expectation that your school or school district has. But you could also have those different times that students could check in if they wanted to work on an activity at a different time. I saw a lot of schools towards the end of the school year doing virtual field days. And in my mind, I always think of field day as kind of like the ideal rotation activity, because you can, look out and you see all the different things going on, and there's a lot of dynamic activities, but you've got to shift to those activities. You've got to learn, what is it that you're trying to do here? What's my goal that I'm trying to accomplish? Whether it's working together or competing individually, you've got all those parts and pieces, but you have to kind of establish that quickly and then move through the activity. So I think that's, there's definitely a lot of potential there. And I think applying that to a virtual setting certainly could happen. Any other questions about any of the three models that we went over? All right, so for our activity, and I had kind of designed this with the idea that this is something that people that are joining us live right now can participate in, and we'll be able to kind of go over some of those pieces. But this is also an activity that people that are watching this video in the future, they can participate in as well. So I've created a Google slide presentation, and it's essentially a series of the sheet that you can see in the upper right there of learning, blended learning models. So I've got the three models that I covered up there. So I think our group size is small enough that I think you guys can self-assign. I don't think we need to go through and assign you numbers. If you were doing this activity with students or even with adults, you might want to go through that process of assigning slides. So they're not going in and like messing up somebody else's work, but hopefully we can kind of work through that process. On these slides, I don't need you to put your name, but if you could maybe put your position at a school and maybe the grade level that you work at, it might help you kind of frame, or others reading those examples, it might help them kind of frame what your thinking is, where you're coming from. So what I would like people to do is to pick one of the three models that they think would work best for them. So this is not you committing to what you're going to be doing next school year or at any point in the future. I'm just kind of looking for maybe some insights and maybe some ideas that we can share around. If you were to pick one of these models, the one that you think you could adapt best to your kind of classroom and your teaching approach, you can actually, when we go to the slide, you'll be able to move that circle to circle the one that you select. Then in the the bottom text box, I want you to give some sort of justification to why you're picking that one. So it might be the positives of, I think I would like doing a rotation model, and then maybe give some examples of why. Maybe you've used it in the past previously. Maybe you think you could adapt it more easily based on what you focus on in your classroom. Or it might be that you want to maybe say, I think the project-based one would be really difficult for my kids because of yada, yada, yada. So I want you to, in that justification box, you can put positives, but don't feel like you only have to put positives. If there are things that are maybe challenging about the other ones, feel free to add those in as well. This is just kind of a activity for us to be reflecting on how to actually go through this process. And like I said before, we only picked out 3 models. There are many other models out there. We will give you access to kind of information if you want to explore some other models, but we thought it'd be much easier to just focus on a narrow 3 here. So in the chat, I think we can probably share the link to that activity, and people can type that in as well. Trying to grab that link. All right, so I've shared the link in the chat, so you can go to that. I do want to point out, if you're ever using Bitly for links, you can customize that backend. That can be really helpful. You do want to remember, though, it is case sensitive. That can certainly throw people off. So if we navigate over to the document, you should be able to see, as people are coming on, if they're on a slide, they should be able to see on the left-hand side if there are multiple people on. There should be a little icon, so just make sure you're navigating to a slide where someone else is not.
And we'll give everyone just a few minutes to kind of work through this.
Yep.
All right, how's everyone doing? Do we need a little bit more time, or are we feeling good? Thumbs up, thumbs down. I got like a half. That was like a halfway thumb from Julia, I think. It was like it's off to the side. I wasn't sure.
I was
So-
not actually looking at what I looked like in the moment. I was just like, thumb, you can have this. Give some kind of feedback.
I think there are probably a few pieces of information there that people are going to want just about what we just did. So I'll take a second to break that down. Maybe there's some people that are still working. You can work. I'm going to explain how we made some of that magic work. So I set up in Google Slides, I set up a kind of my template. So if you think of it like a worksheet, I set that up and then I exported that as an image and then pulled that image into a new Google slide presentation, the one that you guys are on, but I made it the background. And because it was the background, people couldn't change it. So that's kind of one of the tricks if you want to have something that students can't mess up. Could they delete the slides? Absolutely. Could they, delete text boxes and add other junk in? Yes. But I mean, for the most part, it has that static form and they're not going to be accidentally clicking and messing things up on there. So that was the key, is I put that in as a background. Having students navigate onto that, obviously you have those indicators, even though you don't know what names are. If you did have a a G Suite structure, you would be able to see those students' names. So that would be helpful if you're using G Suite and had students logging in that way. But for us, people are coming up as, different anonymous animals or fictional creatures, and they're able to actually see if other people are on their slide, and they can go through and find an empty slide. Sometimes it makes sense to assign a specific slide. Sometimes it's just, enough to direct them, find an empty slide. You want to make sure you have enough slides. Duplicating can get a little messy. The music part of it, I think what's nice about that is adding that music in is such a nice cue. If kind of the time frame, there are pieces of music that you certainly could find that kind of have that up and down. If anybody's ever done a Breakout EDU session, their music is very tailored to the time. So that's always one of the ones I think of if you're using music in the classroom. Those ones kind of produce some anxiety for folks. I think having some music in the background, it's a nice cue just so it's filling up that dead air. While students are filling that in, what I like about it is I actually can go in on my side and I can navigate through the slides and see people making progress on that work, which is nice to be able to see that in real time. So couple nice pieces there. I think we were hoping that's a model we've been wanting to use. And actually we have a much smaller enrollment today, I think because of the time shift. So it worked out perfectly.
Yeah, having a collaborative slide deck like that can get pretty out of control if you have 100 people.
Yeah.
So it's much easier with a group of 40 or less. The question in the chat was about the music and how to actually do that. And I'll just quickly, this is something we could totally experiment with at 3:00 if you want to, because that's what the whole session's about. But just really quickly, when you go to share your screen, there is an option that I hardly ever remember to click at the very bottom of it that says share computer sound. And when you do that, you can play anything on your computer for people to hear. What I did was I went to YouTube and I just typed in copyright free upbeat jazz music. And that's what came up. So you could do all sorts of things, but if you are including music, just try to keep in mind that copyright consideration.
And for us especially, we're going to be uploading this to YouTube. It'd be really unfortunate if our video got flagged and all the audio is disabled because we used, a music clip for a second. So just something to think about. So Emma, can I actually take control of the screen? I wanted to show a couple, unless you want to go through and
no, go right
show some
for
models.
it.
So certainly you guys can go through at your leisure and look through some of these models. But I think what's nice about this, I can see, hey, look, and we start with a elementary phys ed teacher. So we can kind of see their justification down at the bottom for wanting to use, actually this one, it looks like they had a rotation model. So the other part of it, I can see this, and actually slide that guy over there. So as a teacher, and you could always peel back access. So if you wanted to take away that editing access at a certain point, you could certainly do that. You could maybe open it up to comments if you could have students comment on other people's work. So a couple considerations there to make as well. So in looking through these, I mean, you can quick glance through and just get a sense of which ones are the most popular. So in terms of that instant feedback, this is gonna be a nice way to check. Oh, that's good. I can see somebody typing live. I love that. So hopefully this is useful for people, just to kind of give them a sense. One, this is, I think, a useful tool. And what I really love about this is somebody could join this in the future. So people watching this video after today, they could hop on here. And if you didn't notice, I have like 50 slides on there. So maybe we'll have to watch this them and see if it fills up, and maybe we'll have to add more. But somebody on this could actually duplicate those slides and do their own thing. So there's definitely a lot of potential here. And thanks to the revision history, if you ever had somebody go in and blow up everybody's work, you can always, pull back and get that back. So couple things to keep in mind. So
I think that this is a good example too, to kind of talk about that, the idea that this is an asynchronous activity generally, because you have, like, if you're doing this virtually, then, I mean, right now, the way we did it was totally synchronous, but the way that you would probably be setting this up for your students is that you would have them kind of complete it on their own time. So this is an example that could totally be either one, and it could also have elements of both, because you could have people on here who are connecting at the same time. So this is just a good example to kind of look at the differences and the similarities, and how asynchronous and synchronous can be used together. They're not necessarily an always either or type of deal.
absolutely. So thank you so much for participating in that.
May I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So, John, this is one document, right? That we all collaborate in.
Yep.
Document slide.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So the original, I should say that, so the original background piece, I also did on slides, but I did it separately. So the one that we're working on, we're all working on the same Google Slides presentation. But to make that initial template so people couldn't change that, I did that on a separate slide and then just export it. But you don't have to use Google Slides to make that template. I've seen teachers have, worksheets that they like that they've taken a picture of or scanned in or something like that. This is just a way to make it into the background so people aren't inadvertently kind of changing that piece. All right, moving on from there. So we did, as we had mentioned, we did share in this document, we'll be sending this slide deck out within the next 24 hours. But on here, there are some other blended learning resources. So we looked at the website a little bit, and we shared some articles in here. That 12 types of blended learning, I think, is really interesting to look at, in that it looks at some of these, but it also branches off into other areas and kind of different focuses. So if you're interested in some other blended learning models or kind of some more information, certainly these links in here are easy to access and really great materials.
Yeah, and I would add that the third resource kind of talks a lot about online learning as well. So it's nice to kind of see, you'll find that a lot of blended learning discussions target face-to-face in-person class and then out of class at home. But a lot of the fundamentals are totally transferable to a virtual classroom and, the asynchronous connection that they'll have as well. So just kind of keep that in mind. I know that where we are focusing on remote learning, I just wanted to emphasize that that third resource does really speak to the online piece more than the other two.
So we always like to end with a checklist. So our little blended learning checklist. Start with the outcomes and goals and kind of work backwards from there. Be familiar with the characteristics of both asynchronous and synchronous learning. So we kind of went over some of the differences between the two and how you might leverage each of those to ensure purpose in the use of synchronous and asynchronous learning. So always being purposeful on which one you're using and how you're using it. And then to consider different blended learning models. And obviously we went into some and gave you some options with that activity, but there are others out there. And, you know, what is a blended model in a brick and mortar setting versus a online setting is very different. So just be aware that there are a lot of models out there that you can be accessing and learning from. All right, and any questions? So if you have any questions, if you want to unmute yourself, that's fine. If you have a question you want to throw in the chat, that works as well.
All right. Yeah, it's a lot to process, so I'm not surprised that there are not a lot of questions. So I think it's one of those things you kind of got to dig a little bit deeper into it in like that reflection phase. So if questions do come up in the next few minutes, like John said, feel free to either unmute or toss them in the chat. But I'm going to share the information about certificates. I'm going to preface this by telling you all that I am desperately trying to fix the problems with the certificates. This link should be a really good start. This is the same form, but I have added a piece where it asks you which session you attended. When you choose the session that you attended, it will link you to the certificate for that session. The only thing that I'm going to mention is that you will then have to, once you open the certificate, you'll have to go back to the form to answer the question of if you attended live or not, and then hit submit. I could not put a custom link at the end for each one, which would have been so nice, because then you could have hit submit and get the link still. But in order to make it so that you can kind of just fill that form out and get whatever certificates that you're missing, in order to do that, that was the easiest way. I will be sending that out via email as well. So if you want the link or anything like that, it will come in an email. I have gotten emails, but we've just been so crazy overwhelmed. I haven't had a chance to respond to anybody. So I am very sorry about that. But hopefully this will solve all of the problems. And if anyone on this call was a part of any of the EdTech series, I will be adding those to this form as well. So if you are still like have loose ends from that series, feel free to use this form as well. Those are not there yet. They will be though. So we have about 5 to 8 minutes left. We won't keep anybody here longer than they want to be here, but I just want to kind of round back around. If anyone has any thoughts they want to share, questions, you know, how did asynchronous learning go for you? How did virtual learning go? Like, were there anything that you know, were surprised by that was a really great success? Anything like that?
I guess I have one question. I have not, as a student or a teacher, had much success with the flipped learning. And I was wondering if anybody here or if you two have examples, and high school music. So, but of that working and how to get that to work.
So by working, do you mean like the design of it so that it actually is successful, or?
Yeah, success. So just like the like you were talking about earlier, like the student gains, the educational gains, like lots of frustration or students not knowing enough about how to even get started? Like, I'm just wondering if I think it could be a really good model, and I'm wondering if anybody has used it and has thoughts about it.
I think the model that when I first really saw a flipped classroom model that I really liked was when I was working in RSU4 at their high school level. They did it for their health and PE classes. And I don't know if they still, through the Oak Hill High School website, still have some of that information on there. They did at one point that kind of explained their model because it was really different. I think sometimes people need some explanation as to how it worked. But it was really good in terms of students had those different parts and pieces that they needed to do. And because of the physical activity part of it and it being very self-directed, it seemed to work really well in that students were motivated to do the stuff that they needed to do, maybe outside of class, maybe the more health-oriented parts. So when they came in, they were really looking forward to maybe doing some of the physical education requirements in there. So that was one that I saw in practice and heard a lot about being in that district. So that's, I think, a nice example. And I always I think with specials teachers, sometimes because you have so many students that you're working with, as opposed to just like a small classroom, sometimes those larger models seem like totally unwieldy. Like, how do I make this work? With Julia, that might be the case for you, that you have so many students. How would you make this work? And I think the challenge there is, how do you create those activities that students will want to do outside of class, so when they come to class, they'll be ready to participate?
Right. I think like individual practice is kind of a flipped model in a way, right? Like they're preparing the songs and coming, but I was just trying to think in terms of like content or something, like a way to use that. But that's good to know. Thank you.
May I?
And it can be one of those things that if you're having students, maybe you're watching videos in class or reading things in class, that you're doing that outside of school, outside of kind of the regular class time. So if they've watched those videos and, digested those when they come to class, there's kind of that expectation. But there's always the issue is, what if they don't do that work? And I think that's one of the big challenges.
May I interject?
Absolutely.
I'm maybe beating a dead horse at this point, but the basic idea, and again, I think you probably are, Julie, you already have a sense of it. The flipped lesson concept is that you're front loading the material first. In a music lesson, if you're talking about individual instruments, that I'm not particularly sure of, given my musical background. But if you're talking about musical theory, musical history, then those, I think, would very specifically fall into the category of front-loading material, in the sense of reading about the life of Bach, or listening. It's actually a video I'm working on right now for my students, more for fun, a compilation of music with different time signatures to talk about the concept of rhythm. John's point is unfortunately the bottom line key. In order to have a flipped lesson successful, the students have to have seen and worked with the material before they come to class. Otherwise it's not going to work. That's the one biggest drawback. But if you're working with material that they should be looking at or hearing before they come to class, it's an effective technique.
Absolutely.
I am just going to drop in the chat in case it's of interest. It's from 2016, so it's a few years old, but this is, it's targeted towards elementary, so it's not quite as helpful. But there are some really great success stories in this article that might help to provide some food for thought, ideas you might be able to adapt for your audience.
And I think there are obviously some developmental challenges that you might run into, that getting students to, access content outside of class can definitely be a challenge. When they're in high school, they have other things maybe that they want to do. When they're younger, just kind of that management of accessing whatever it is that they need to access, or
Having
being
stuff actually get out of the backpack when it's at home.
exactly. So I think there are kind of some different challenges along the way. Some of them are consistent through the grade spans, but I think one of the best things is if that in-class time feels really energizing and motivating, and if students can't really participate in a full capacity because they haven't done the work outside of class, then I think that sometimes can be a motivator. It can be really, I think, frustrating as a teacher, having experienced that. If you have a student and they're just like, I didn't do what I needed to do, and now I can't do the fun project that we're doing, then it can be hard to do that. But sometimes, there's tough lessons in life. I think of, I had, and this was student choice. Students, when we covered the Revolutionary War, they wanted to do sock puppet shows of different vignettes of the Revolutionary War, which it was the end of the school year. I said, yep, that's fine. We'll make that work. But those students that didn't do the preparation, when it was time to show off the sock puppet scenes at the end, those kids, they quickly realized, like, oh, we didn't do any scripting or planning, or we didn't make all the characters that we needed. And it was really, I think, frustrating and sad for those kids, but they really could see that in a very obvious way, like, oh, this would have been really fun. And I mean, you can try to motivate them and prod them, and as their peers were making stuff and it was creating an exciting environment, they kind of, some of them bought in, but then you're running up against time if you're late to buying into an activity. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. I think we had some good conversation. You guys were a great group for trying out our Google Slides activity. Hopefully that's something that folks will consider using themselves in the future.
And for joining us 2 hours past our scheduled time.
Yes.
Awesome. Have a great afternoon.
Okay. Bye, everybody.